Dear Professor, today our friend Mr. Alebachew Dessalegn has a special program. He would like to introduce to the public again about the distinguished professor, Dr. Richard Pankhurst. I'm sure many of us know about this honorable scholar, who is Ethiopia's best friend, as we read from his documented writings on any subject on Ethiopia. To me, Professor Richard Pankhurst, you are an encyclopedia of Ethiopia. Dear Professor, we would like to thank you very, very much for giving us this opportunity to know more about you, your family, and Ethiopia. May I ask you certain questions just so that the Ethiopian public or the outside public can know who you are exactly and to know more about Ethiopia? Can you introduce us your life and your family?
I'm a student of Ethiopian culture. I first went to Ethiopia in 1951 and went in 1956 to live in Ethiopia. I taught at the University College of Addis Ababa while my wife Rita was at the National Library of Ethiopia. We have lived off and on in Ethiopia most of the time for 9 months of the year, or over 9 months of the year, coming to Britain for a couple of months in the summer. We are now in London in the summer of 2007. I've written on various subjects of Ethiopian history and culture. I started off writing on economic history of Ethiopia, and then gradually moved towards the cultural history of Ethiopia, the social history of Ethiopia. I've been involved in various campaigns at the same time, being a founder member of the Return of the Aksum Obelisk Committee and a member of AFAMED, the Association for the Return of Ethiopian Magdala Treasures.
You have been a long time researcher and writer in Ethiopia. How do you describe Ethiopia and Ethiopianness?
Well, this is a difficult question because Ethiopia has been in existence so long. Its frontiers have changed, its composition has changed, but I would say that Ethiopia is an independent state in northeast Africa, stretching from the Red Sea inland to the Awash and even further south towards the borders of Kenya. Ethiopianness is the preservation of Ethiopian culture. It's a belief in the importance of Ethiopian culture. It's a determination to preserve Ethiopian culture. And I think that that is something that we should all commit ourselves to.
Can you tell us about the term Abyssinia and when it was changed and why?
Well, essentially Ethiopia has had two names. One, Ethiopia, the other, Abyssinia. Ethiopia was originally a name coined by the Greeks for the dark-skinned people south of Egypt, and as time went on it came to represent Ethiopia as we now know it, the Aksumite kingdom, onwards to the present. On the other hand, there was a group of people towards the coast called the Habashat, and they came in contact with the Arabs. The Arabs called them Habashat, and then this got corrupted to Habasha or Abash, and from that came the idea of Abyssinia. So that these two names were parallel. One was a name introduced through the Greeks, Ethiopia. The other was a name introduced through the Arabs, Habasha or Abyssinia. The complicating element is that Habash means mixed, and over the centuries many Ethiopians did not like to be called Abyssinian, because they thought that it meant mixed. But in fact it didn't originally mean mixed at all. It was a corruption of the ethnic name of the Habashat. So that over the centuries sometimes you find people calling the country Abyssinia, Abyssinie in French, Abyssinia in Italian, and on the other hand you have people calling it Ethiopia. The Ethiopian state, as you see in the Ethiopian royal letters and inscriptions, always considered itself to be Ethiopia. And yet at the same time you find the word Abyssinian applied to food, Habasha food and Habasha clothing and so forth. But I think that really one should stick to Ethiopia as the more traditional name, a name which is also enshrined in the Bible.
Don't you think that the Arabs have a bad connotation when they say Habash?
I think so, because they've got this idea that it means mixed. At the same time, we know some Ethiopians, real Ethiopians, who, when they're critical of the Ethiopian state, bureaucracy and so forth, say, we Abyssinians, in a sort of derogatory way, although they would be proud to consider themselves Ethiopian. At the same time, they might say, we have Abyssinians, are not efficient or whatever.
Right. Ethiopia had many wars to defend the survival of her independence. What do you think were or are the main motives to do that repeatedly?
Well, I think in order to survive one has to fight, and it's those countries that fought for their independence in whatever continent we're talking about which survived. Ethiopia was unique in Africa in that it survived the European scramble for Africa due to the patriotism of the Ethiopian people, but also, I suppose, thanks to the mountains which made it difficult for invaders to penetrate. And also in political international terms, in terms of international relations, one has to see that Ethiopia was at a kind of crossroads where British and French imperialism clashed. And so Menelik in particular was able to use one great power to protect him against another great power, so that by turning to the French he was able to resist the British, by turning to the British he was able to defend himself against the Italians and so forth. But of course it was a great effort at a great cost. Large numbers of Ethiopians died in the struggle, and because of the struggle the modernization of the country was seriously delayed.
Most of us know that you and your family life is strongly related to Ethiopia. Why and how it happened?
I suppose it happened because of developments in Europe. My mother was a student of art in Italy. She was in Italy when she saw the fascist thugs beating out the Italian public before he seized power. That is in 1919. And she was involved in founding societies for Italian freedom, and in particular a society named after Matteotti, an Italian parliamentary deputy who was murdered by Mussolini. She formed a society in support of that. When she saw Italy preparing to invade Ethiopia, she was shocked, partly because as an anti-fascist, she was against fascism. She felt that whereas she was internationalist, fascism was nationalist and chauvinistic, whereas she was feminist, fascism wanted to have women as breeders of soldiers for the Duce, and whereas she was socialist, the socialists were being imprisoned in Italy. She believed in the independence of Ethiopia and was shocked that the only surviving country which had survived the expansion of imperialism was being attacked, and she was involved in forming societies in support of Ethiopia. She ran a newspaper in support of Ethiopia from 1936 onwards for 20 years, and as a result of that I got to know some of the first Ethiopian refugees in England at the time of the fascist occupation. Hakim Workney, for example, and his children. His children were great friends of mine, they were my age. Later I got to know the first Ethiopian students who came to England after the war for study, people like Lich Mikhail and the artist Afwerk Tekle. As far as Afwerk was concerned, my mother had visited his school some years before, and he arrived to study at London Airport. He arrived at London Airport, and there was no one to meet them because it was a holiday, the embassy was closed. And the hostesses there said, "Do you know anybody in England?" He said no. Then he remembered this lady who had visited his school, and they phoned her. She said, "Wait at the airport," and she sent me, and I met him at the airport. He was the first Ethiopian student that I met after the war. So with that kind of development, with those incidents like that, friendships like that, I decided to go to accept an invitation to teach in Ethiopia. In 1956, I joined the then University College of Addis Ababa, and later was involved in establishing the Institute of Ethiopian Studies of Addis Ababa University.
Can you tell us more about your mom, the Honorable Sylvia Pankhurst, Ethiopia's best friend in need and in deed? Why do you have her monument in the special place at the front courtyard of the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa? Is she buried there?
She's buried there. She founded a newspaper in support of Ethiopia, New Times of Ethiopia News, which ran for 20 years. It was involved in exposing the use of poison gas by the fascist invaders, trying to urge the League of Nations to have tighter, stronger sanctions, that sort of thing. She was able to publish news of the resistance of the Ethiopian patriots. Then, as the war in Europe began, she was urging that support should go to Ethiopia, that it should not only be a war against Nazi Germany, but it should be a war against fascist Italy. And when Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, she was very anxious that the British government should recognize Ethiopia as a full ally. In those days, I remember, the BBC used to broadcast a program called National Anthems of the Allies. And then, just after Mussolini declared war on the 10th of June 1940, she turns on the radio and they play this program, but still Ethiopia is not mentioned as an ally. And she agitated on that for something like 9 months before finally the full recognition was given to Ethiopia as a sovereign state. During that time she was also campaigning against various British officials that wanted to establish a protectorate, a British protectorate over Ethiopia, or wanted to partition the country to the advantage of Kenya and British Somaliland and that sort of thing. She was also involved in raising funds for the Princess Ahai Hospital, which was called after the Emperor's daughter, Princess Ahai, who had been a nurse in Britain during the war, and that is the hospital which exists to this day opposite the old airport. It was for things like that that she was honoured by that burial in Selassie Cathedral. Now, as far as that burial is concerned, her wish was to be buried with the Ethiopian patriots. She felt that she was one of them. She had a decoration of being a patriot with 5 leaves for each of the years of the occupation. She wanted to be buried with them, and it was for that reason that the Selassie Cathedral, having been designated as the place of rest for the patriots, that she was placed there. Later, her old friend Rasimru was buried nearby.
Dear Professor, all your children and grands have Ethiopian cultural names, and even Dr. Alula is married to an Ethiopian girl. What do you feel about that?
Well, I'm very proud that he has an Ethiopian wife, and that we have Ethiopian or half Ethiopian grandchildren. I think my mother, who first learnt of Ethiopia, she was very impressed as an artist with Ethiopian art, ecclesiastical manuscript illustration and so forth. She would have been proud to know, which she never learned, she never knew because she died too early, that she would have had Ethiopian daughter-in-law.
You have written much about Ethiopian heritage and culture. Which ones do you admire most?
Well, Ethiopia is a complex country with many different cultures. I am very much impressed, for example, with the Gada system of the Oromos. Sometimes when I look at present politics in the world, I think it would be good if we got rid of some of these leaders and had them changed every 7 years or so. When you see how some of these politicians stay on for decades, that kind of movement would have been a good thing, I think. Then again, I'm very much impressed with Guinea. I learnt a lot about it from my old friend Magister Lemma, who used to recite Guinea to me. And these are just 2 examples. One has to bear in mind that Ethiopia is a country with many cultures, changing cultures, and I'm impressed with all of them, with the combination of them. Many years ago, I became interested in Gabata, the board game Gabata, and I found that it had been condemned by the church at one particular point, as was Centerage, or chess. That caused me to become interested in Ethiopian chess, and I searched amongst the old people. I found that the game of chess was almost forgotten. The only person that was able to tell me about it, as far as the modern generation was concerned, was Lij Mikael Imru, and from his father we got a detailed description of how the various pieces in the board play. Just an example of many aspects of Ethiopian culture in which I've been interested, one in which I've written.
As you are well aware, many of Ethiopians' invaluable manuscripts and antiquities are stolen, looted or taken, directly or indirectly out of Ethiopia. You have been endeavoring for their return home. What do you think would be the fate of these manuscripts and the precious antiquities?
I think we have to see that international law and ideas of justice change over time. There was a time when it was considered good for one country to rule another on the colonial pattern, because people said that that was good for the governed as well as for the governors. Now people accept the idea that rule of one country by another is immoral, and that countries have a right to self-determination. I think the same thing is going to come as far as manuscripts and treasures are concerned. More and more people realize and will realize that it is a crime to steal the property of another country, that people are entitled to their culture, they're entitled to the fruit of their culture, to their manuscripts, their icons, to their obelisks, in the same way as they're entitled to their political freedom. And this is something which I think we have to agitate for. Why shouldn't the children of Ethiopia be able to see the beautiful manuscripts produced by their ancestors? No reason at all. So I feel that this is something that we agitate for. And the biggest stolen item, the obelisk, has been returned. It will be re-erected in about 8 months' time. Work on it has already started. I would like to see, of course, the return of the objects from the British Library, the British Museum, the Bodleian Library in Oxford, Cambridge University Library, and the Royal Library of Windsor Castle. Go to the Royal Library of Windsor Castle. You'll see 6 huge manuscripts, bigger than any you've seen anywhere else. This loot was very considerable, and I think that Ethiopia has suffered from it. For the dignity of the country, for the understanding of the culture, these objects have to be returned.
How much is the government or the church making effort? Because I most of the time go to the British Library, and I have seen many of the precious manuscripts. There is a very special book which I wanted to photocopy, that is the Revelation, with 126 illustrations. Just one to copy, to have a copy of one page, it costs us £126. This is what they told me. And my opinion is, until we get the books, God willing, is it not better to have some of the precious manuscripts scanned in their original color and to have a copy to Ethiopia? This is, would it not be another choice?
I think so. I think at the same time it's a scandal that a manuscript which was stolen and cost nothing should be producing a revenue for the British Library of over £100 per manuscript. But clearly we ought to have, and to some extent the Institute of Ethiopian Studies has achieved, we must have copies of all the manuscripts outside the country. Because we're not only thinking of what was looted from Magdala, we must also think of other manuscripts which may not have been looted, which may have been purchased and so forth. If you are a student in Addis Ababa, you can't afford, you don't have the time or the money to go to the British Library, to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, to go to the Vatican Library and so forth, to see one manuscript here, one manuscript here. You must have copies of all the microfilm copies or photocopies, scanned copies of every Ethiopian manuscript that has been microfilmed in Ethiopia by the EMML project or by any other organization, as well as copies of the looted or non-looted manuscripts. It's not such a difficult task. The number is probably not more than 5,000 outside the country. If we were to copy those, we would take an important step in the advancement of Ethiopian studies. At present, the Institute has something like 2/3 of the British Library manuscripts on microfilm, but only in black and white, because the project was done through the British Council some time ago, before colour photography was so accessible. But now we must have copies of all the manuscripts abroad, and certainly colour copies of any which are illustrated.
Thank you very much. You see, it's not only the British Library, you know, and we have more than 1,000 in France, and in Rome, even in America, and in the Eastern European countries. You have written much about the whereabouts of these books, and so being in England, being in Britain, going to the British Library, whenever I see these manuscripts, just with their colors and with their elegant handwriting, if we don't have the original copy of those books, it would be a disaster for the next generation. And that's why I am asking you these questions. I know the effort you are doing, and I hope you would be successful. I was hoping to have some before the Ethiopian Millennium Celebration, and it didn't happen. I congratulate you on the return of the obelisk from Rome, because you have been fighting for a long time. And we thank you very much for all your efforts, Professor. Unless you do it, nobody can do it.
Well, I fully appreciate your kind words. I have been able to persuade a few small countries like Switzerland and Austria to microfilm all the manuscripts which they have in their collection. They're small. But as you say, we've got to think of the big collections, above all the British Library, Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, Rome, particularly the Vatican, and a large number of manuscripts in smaller libraries scattered over Germany, Eastern Europe, the United States, and we must get those through the good cooperation. Soviet Union, when it was Soviet Union, did give us microfilms for all the manuscripts in the Soviet Union. We have to do that. And also so many other things. I heard yesterday, or day before yesterday, that an Englishman who was in Ethiopia discovered that in the museum in Edinburgh, in the Scottish Museum, there is the small Egyptian stone which James Bruce found in Ethiopia in 1770. It's now in the museum. It's not directly Ethiopian object, but it was found at Addis in Ethiopia, and it reflects the commercial contact between Ethiopia and Egypt in ancient times, in the time of the pharaohs. Now, he asked if he could make a copy of it. They refused. But clearly, we should have a copy of that. We have to think also of continuing what Professor Rubinson did, namely having microfilms of the British, French, German, Italian, Turkish and so forth, diplomatic archives. We must have all that on microfilm. Because the main point, as I see it, is that Ethiopian students can't travel all over the world to study Ethiopia. They have to have these objects in Ethiopia to work on. And also for the younger generation, for the dignity of the younger generation, for their understanding of their culture, they must have the chance to see these historic objects, these beautiful works of culture and so forth, and not just hear about it vaguely. They must actually have a chance to see them with their own eyes.
What is heritage? What's the benefit to the country? What do you advise Ethiopians to protect and promote their heritage?
I feel that any people would be the poorer if they didn't have a heritage, they didn't know their heritage, and that it's important for the cultural dignity of a people, for their self-respect and so forth, to have it. Of course, people will say that heritage is good for tourism, it brings in money for tourism. This is true. I think that we can see that, for example, Aksum with 2 big obelisks instead of 1 will be much more of an artistic tourist attraction. But that's not the main thing. I think we have to look at it in terms of justice, return of loot, return of stolen property, and also in terms of the dignity of a people. A people without a culture is scarcely worthy of the name. And that's where I see the importance of the Ethiopian community, their organization, that they are doing something to preserve Ethiopian culture. We must take action that the young Ethiopians learn their language, Amharic, Tigrinya, Oromo, whatever it is. They must know their language, they must know their culture. We ought to be teaching gears in Ethiopia, in the schools, and the same thing we should be doing for the diaspora.
As a distinguished researcher and a historian, which of the Ethiopian emperors you admire most and why?
Well, this is a difficult question because it brings us into what Johannes Menelik kind of argument. It seems to me that more important than considering the kings, we have to be thinking of the people. And in my writings I've tried to move towards collecting material and writing with a view that somebody who follows me will write the history of the Ethiopian people. But turning to the actual rulers, it seems to me that difficult to judge them inasmuch as we have to rely on the sources which are limited. For example, of recent emperors we know quite a bit through foreign travel literature, through chronicles and so forth. But if we go back, say, to Ezana, what do we know about Ezana? We know about him through just 2 or 3 inscriptions, that kind of thing. Although it's impressive, I think, that Baru Zodi, Ethiopia's foremost historian of the present, called his son after Ezana. And then again, what do we know of Amdatzion? I have a feeling that Amdatzion was not a very pleasant person to be in contact with, but he was a great leader, and maybe he was the greatest ruler of Ethiopian history. But we know so little about it. Then again, we have to see that their greatness depends a lot on their times. Coming to more recent times, we see Tewodros as the great innovator, the person with the vision of unity and modernization, and I would give him a high mark in my support of recognition of rulers. Then again, we forget Johannes. Johannes did, after all, defeat the Egyptians and the dervishes and the Italians at Dogali. So he did, because of the political threat from foreign countries, have a role that sometimes we ignore. Then we have to come to Menelik, the founder of modern Ethiopia, and see that what Tewodros had attempted to do was later accomplished, or began to be accomplished, by Menelik. And so I think we have to also see it as a kind of process. What Tewodros envisaged, Menelik began, Yigzaw continued to some extent in a short reign, Haile Selassie continued. So I think we have to see it as a process. So that I'm reluctant to give sort of full marks to any one ruler and plump to say he's my favourite emperor. I think that there are a number, and we have to see them as part of a general process of modernization, if we think of the 19th and 20th centuries, and survival of Ethiopian independence earlier, as well as the development of culture.
Mm-hmm. How do you see Emperor's title?
Well, I think that's a question that you should pass to Rita, who has talked a lot about title and gave a paper in Norway related to title. But on my side, I would recall that the famous occasion when the Italian envoy Antonelli came to Shoa to discuss the Treaty of Ucciali. He said, you know, the Treaty of Ucciali had specified in the Ethiopian version that Ethiopia could make use of the good offices of the Italians in his negotiation with foreign powers. In the Italian version, it changed it, and he said he must make use of the good offices on the basis of which the Italians claimed to protectorate. And then Antonelli comes as Italian envoy, and he says, we can't tell the world that we were mistaken in Article 17 of the Treaty of Ucciali because we have our honour to protect. And Taito goes forward and says, we Ethiopians, we have our honour to protect also. I think Menelik was perhaps too friendly with foreigners and trusted them too much. Taito was always very careful to watch, were these people honest, these Frenchies that were coming. So I think in a way Menelik wanted development and wanted to have good relations with technicians and explorers and so forth. But Taito was always saying, are you sure that this man is genuine?
What kind of system of government do you vision for Ethiopia in the future, just for the development and to protect the survival of our independence?
It's a difficult question. There was a time when Ethiopian intellectuals felt that they should follow the example of Japan, which maintained its independence and its culture, particularly after its war with Russia. And so you have the Japanizers. Then later on you had the socialist experiment and the belief that Ethiopia should follow the Eastern European Russian example. At the same time, before and afterwards, the idea was that Ethiopia should follow the Western European American capitalist line. All these have in fact, to a large extent, failed. I wonder whether it's not a case of Ethiopian scholars, Ethiopian economists, Ethiopian politicians, Ethiopian social scientists to devise and work out a new Ethiopian road to progress, to technological advancement, and at the same time, as you say, the preservation of independence, because independence can be lost in war, but it can also be lost through economic linkages and economic domination. Maybe African alignment would be one solution, and I think at the same time one has to look at the geopolitics of the Horn of Africa. What have you got? You've got this large landlocked country, Ethiopia, the most populous country in the world without access to the sea. You've got the small Eritrean coast, a country consisting mainly of coast and 2 ports. You've got Djibouti, again, a terminus of a railway, of no importance without the railway, and yet of fundamental importance of the railway. And similarly, the whole Somali region, Somalia and Puntland. These territories have to be economically linked, at least. You must have some kind of economic union, federation perhaps, maybe common monetary policy, common market, something of that kind. I think one has to see that in the long run the integration of the Horn of Africa has to take place, maybe politically, maybe only economically, but in either case there must be an economic linkage. As in Europe, you see the European countries coming more or less successfully, more and more together. The same thing must take place on the Horn of Africa, what we call the Greater Horn.
Tell us something which you want.
Well, I think that this is a time, if this is addressed, if I'm speaking to the Ethiopian diaspora, it's a time when the diaspora has to struggle for its existence in the country of its adoption, but at the same time must not forget Ethiopia and must contribute to Ethiopian development. One thing that I was recently in the United States, which I found very interesting, was groups of Ethiopian doctors deciding to give 1 month of their life to work in Ethiopia. That they go for 1 month and work in an Ethiopian hospital, bringing in the equipment and the new latest knowledge and so forth. And then next month another group comes. Things like that would be valuable. It would be an important contribution to Ethiopia if the diaspora that doesn't want to leave, to return to Ethiopia, could come for a short time to work on certain projects and help to develop greater contacts between Ethiopia and the outside world, as well as assisting the process of modernization. Because in the last analysis it seems to me that what have we had? We've had in the 19th century the development of the Industrial Revolution, technological change in Europe, spreading from Britain to France to Europe, finally in the middle of the 19th century to Egypt. And that's the situation in which Tewodros appeared. Still we see innovations, technological innovations of all kinds going on in the world. Ethiopia has all the time to struggle to keep up with this modernization process. And I think the diaspora can help in that respect, in helping to modernize the country, helping to build up contacts between Ethiopia and the outside world.
Our Honorable Lady Rita Pankhurst, we are happy to have you here, and we would like to ask you certain questions. And my first question is, how did we get this Superman?
Well, we met for the first time when we were both teaching in the evening in an institution in the East End of London called Toynbee Hall, and Richard was teaching and I was teaching French and he was teaching economic history in the evening. And it's actually rather a long story. And what happened was that I was working at Chatham House, which is the Royal Institute of International Affairs, in the press library, and there was a Nigerian student looking at these press cuttings, and he was interested in an English wife. And there were 14 of us in the press library, and I think he proposed to all of us in turn. And then when we said no, because he was rather a sort of not terribly serious person, he would then present us with a part of his thesis, which was on the Sudan, and ask us to correct the English. So I had my copy, it was my turn, and I said, thank you, no. And he said, well, could you correct this chapter in my thesis? I had with me, when I was signing the register, the envelope, which had his name on it. Now it so happened that this person was at the London School of Economics, and Richard knew him. So he said, oh, do you know this man? I said, yes, I know him. And that's how we started talking. And also, the registrar of that college was Fred de Halpert, a person who had been to Ethiopia. And somehow the connection was made about Ethiopia. And that was really the beginning of our meeting, you see. So we met there, and then about a year later, he says to me, my mother and I are going to Ethiopia. Would you like to come? Ethiopia? I was interested in Japan at that time, and I was quite puzzled by this. I didn't say anything. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that he and his mother went in July 1956, I think, and I went in November 1956. So we've been together 51 years now.
How do we see him?
Well, you know, over time, as you spend a long time with one person, you understand a lot more about them, and the things that annoy you become acceptable, because it's no good being angry with people all the time. And in fact, you rather see that there are advantages to those things. So I see him as completely absorbed in anything to do with Ethiopia. So for example, if we had guests and there was general conversation, he would sort of be present, but not very much. But if anybody mentioned Ethiopia, or the notion of Ethiopia arose, he was already immediately interested. And similarly, if in any landscape or situation there would be, say, the word Ethiopia in some written document, something they would say Ethiopia, immediately his attention would focus on that. So I realized very soon that really everything to do with Ethiopia was of great concern to him, and everything not to do with Ethiopia was not much concern to him, not so much concern to him, except sort of other things that impinged on Ethiopia, like fascism and so on. So I became aware of this, one aspect. Another aspect is that if I asked him to help me to do something in the house, arrangement or something, he would do it, but his heart was not in it. But if I wanted to write something, do any kind of intellectual work, he would support me all the way, you know. If I was writing something on names, he would find me the references on names in history, put me on the right path, give me the information with which to write. So he's always been very interested in academic activity, and not particularly interested in things like sport, which he thought was rather silly, you know, just running after a ball and other things. But as soon as you were in the academic sphere, and especially anything to do with Ethiopia, he would be very interested and very supportive, not just of me, but of anybody. You know, our house is continually visited by people who are interested in something in Ethiopia. Maybe they're making a film, they're writing a novel, they're doing some research on some historical figure, all kinds of inquiries. if they're about Ethiopia, he would give all his time to that. And so, you know, one adapts to that kind of person, you know. I mean, kind of person is a manner of speaking, because I don't know other people like that. It's just that that's his singularity and his difference, and I came to appreciate these things more and more.